I tried to warn you as much as possible, but I think we were both totally surprised by the reaction after the first few months when we had to face what actually happened. So I think you can have as many conversations and try and prepare as much as possible, but we were totally unprepared. What happens when silence is louder than any explanation? This is precisely the moment that hit Britain with full force when Prince Harry, after a long period of reticence, appeared in public and did something no one expected. He spoke and left out crucial details. No familiar defenses, no ritualized loyalty, no well-worn formulas. Instead, a lesson was created that reverberated through the public debate like a blow, abruptly halting the usual interpretations. The appearance seemed soberly controlled and strikingly minimalist. Observers immediately registered what was missing: the usual recourse to shared narratives that had previously shaped every public assessment. Where before a united front had been signaled, now stood the individual. It wasn't the words themselves that caused irritation, but what was deliberately left unsaid. In a media landscape accustomed to over-explanation and emotionally charged sensationalism, this restraint unleashed an unexpected explosive force. In Britain, an intense analysis began immediately. Commentators paused. Headlines became more cautious, the tone shifted. Instead of outrage, questions dominated. Why now? Why this way, and why without the usual context? Answers were absent, but it was precisely this absence that lost its significance. It didn't come across as uncertainty, but rather as a deliberate distancing, a signal that had shifted slightly. The new neutrality was striking. The tone remained matter-of-fact, almost detached. No accusations, no emotional appeals, no justifications. For many observers, this was disconcerting because it suspended the familiar mechanism: attack and counterattack, accusation and defense. This mechanism was absent. Instead, a vacuum emerged, creating space for new interpretations. Was this the beginning of a redefinition of her own role, or a quiet farewell to a narrative that had been considered immutable for years? Music. In the UK public sphere, it quickly became clear that this appearance did not seem spontaneous. The controlled choice of words, the deliberate pauses, and the consistent avoidance of familiar references. Music suggested preparation. Not in the sense of a staged performance, but as a conscious decision to chart a new course. The impact was enormous. The debate shifted from the question of guilt to the question of responsibility and independence. Particularly noteworthy was the fact that Meghan Markle music was not mentioned. This absence became the central topic of conversation. For years, public communication had been considered inseparable. Music, inextricably intertwined. Now this connection was broken. This left room for speculation, but also for a sober reassessment. Analysts spoke of a strategic distancing of narratives, not necessarily of the relationship itself, but of its public presentation. A step that fundamentally changed the existing dynamics in Britain and beyond. The feeling grew that one was witnessing a turning point. No dramatic revelation, no scandal in the classic sense, but a quiet break with enormous impact. Reactions ranged from unease to cautious respect, because those who refrain from explanations force their audience to think for themselves. That seemed to be precisely the intention here. This first step marked the beginning of a new phase. Not through volume, but through control. Not through confrontation, but through omission. The question that now arose was unavoidable. Does this silence signify a final farewell to old patterns, or is it the prelude to a more fundamental reassessment of what was previously considered established? Attention quickly shifted from form to content, because while the recent musical appearance was notable for its deliberate silence, a far-reaching re-evaluation of earlier decisions was beginning to take shape in the background. Prince Harry did not question his past, but he did so in a raw, unemotional, and not accusatory way, with an almost matter-of-fact detachment that surprised many observers. In the public eye, his decisions were long seen as a clear break with the royal family, a withdrawal from institutional structures, and the establishment of a new life outside Great Britain. These steps were interpreted either as a courageous act of liberation or as a fateful error. Now, however, a third perspective emerged, one that sounded less like justification and more like analysis. Instead of reigniting old conflicts, a pattern began to take shape that suggested reflection. Decisions were not reversed, but placed in a context that had previously received little attention. It wasn't about assigning blame, but about the state of information, about assumptions that were considered certain at certain times, and about the realization that these assumptions might later prove to be incomplete. This very shift created unease in the British debate, because it raised a crucial question. What if key decisions were made not out of complete conviction, but based on limited perspectives? This consideration touched a raw nerve. For years, the public image had been clearly defined. Now, subtle cracks were beginning to appear. What was striking was that Prince Harry offered no form of defense. No attacks on the institution, no emotional blame-shifting. Instead, the impression was one of a sober retrospective, one that neither begged for forgiveness nor sought understanding. Music. It was precisely this restraint that amplified the effect, as it deprived the debate of its usual drama and compelled observers to look more closely. In Britain, this development was intensely discussed. Commentators noted that the reassessment did not appear as a tactical retreat, but rather as an internal order. Decisions were not labeled as mistakes, but as the results of a music-specific state of knowledge. And this point was crucial. If the state of knowledge at the time was limited, then responsibility inevitably had to be reconsidered. This shifted perspective. The actor was perceived less as a driving force and more as a reactive one, as someone responding to situations that were already in motion. This interpretation noticeably changed the tone of the reporting. Moral judgment gave way to structural analysis. The question of autonomy was particularly sensitive in this context. For years, it was assumed that all decisions were made completely autonomously. Now, the impression arose that influencer consultations and strategic considerations played a greater role than previously admitted. This realization not only called the past into question but also the concept of responsibility and control. During this phase, it became clear that this was not about settling scores. It was about contextualization, about the willingness to measure decisions not only by their consequences but also by the circumstances of their creation. For many in the British public, this was an unfamiliar approach, but one that increasingly resonated. The re-evaluation of past decisions seemed like a quiet transition, away from emotional attributions and toward a more dispassionate analysis. But it was precisely this dispassionateness that made the development so explosive, as it opened the door to a far more delicate question. If decisions were based on incomplete information, who bore the responsibility for what was never fully disclosed? With the re-evaluation of earlier decisions, an aspect that had long remained in the shadows increasingly came to the fore. The question of what Prince Harry didn't know. Not framed as an accusation, not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet yet consequential realization. For the closer the past years were examined, the clearer it became that crucial information often lay outside his immediate field of vision. In the public eye, he had long been considered a fully informed actor, someone who consciously supported every escalation and actively encouraged every escalation. But this image began to crumble. Evidence mounted that numerous developments took place in spaces to which he had no access. Decisions were prepared, discussions held, and strategies developed without his involvement in all phases. What appeared outwardly as unity was apparently based internally on the selective dissemination of information. The time lag was particularly explosive. Insights often reached him only when the consequences were already visible. Media reactions, institutional tensions, and public controversies appeared to him as surprising results, not as planned steps. This asymmetry between action and knowledge created a structural imbalance that only became fully apparent in retrospect. Meghan Markle played a central role in this context, though this wasn't explicitly stated. For years, she publicly presented herself as reserved and reactive. This portrayal conveyed the impression that external forces dictated events, while she merely reacted. However, internally, evidence mounted pointing to more proactive management. Communication strategies, strategic considerations, and media decisions apparently ran in parallel, without being fully transparent. For Prince Harry, this realization represented a painful shift in perspective. Loyalty had long led him to refrain from asking questions, from challenging assumptions, and instead focus on defending. This stance appeared cohesive to the outside world, but increasingly fragile internally. Minor inconsistencies, contradictory actions, and unexpected reactions accumulated. Only in retrospect did they reveal a pattern. This pattern suggested that his role was less about shaping events than about protecting them. He reacted to crises that had already been set in motion without fully understanding their origins. In public, he assumed responsibility, while the origins of many conflicts remained hidden. This led to a paradoxical situation. He became the face of the escalation without having initiated it. In Britain, this perspective sparked a new debate. The question was no longer whether decisions were right or wrong, but how informed they were. Responsibility was renegotiated, not as a moral accusation, but as a structural problem. Who acts based on what information, and who controls the flow of information? These questions touched a raw nerve, as they touched not only on individual relationships but also on the mechanisms of modern public relations. The targeted management of knowledge, the selection of what is disseminated, and the deliberate omission of certain details are central tools of narrative construction. In this case, they seem to have generated a dynamic that only became apparent much later. For Prince Harry, this realization marked a turning point, not in the form of a public break, but as an internal censorship. His confidence in the completeness of his own perception was shaken. Loyalty remained, but it was accompanied by doubt. And this doubt changed everything, because anyone who realizes they didn't know everything inevitably begins to re-examine the entire situation. At the end of this section, there was no accusation, but rather an open question. The realization that knowledge was selective called the past into question and revealed an uncomfortable truth. When crucial information was missing, the silence wasn't an expression of agreement, but the result of a gap, and this gap demanded answers. But who had created it, and for what reason? With the growing awareness of incomplete information flows, the focus of the public debate shifted to a broader picture. It was no longer just about personal decisions or internal dynamics, but about how Britain itself gradually became the projection screen for a conflict-ridden narrative. A narrative that solidified over the years and became increasingly sharp. In the public eye, Britain appeared more and more frequently as a rigid antagonist. As a country that refused modernization, lacked empathy, and acted in a structurally hostile manner. This escalation simplified complex relationships and bundled various conflicts into a single cause. For many observers, this development long seemed plausible. It fit a familiar pattern of tradition versus change. But with the passage of time, this picture began to falter. Analyses showed that criticism of Britain was deployed with striking consistency. Regardless of the occasion, accusations always landed on the same target. Media reports, public reactions, and strategic statements mutually reinforced this effect. The country became a symbol, not an actor, a role that made dissent difficult and suppressed nuance. For Prince Harry, this development meant a further shift in perspective. The realization that not every escalation necessarily arose from institutional coldness, but rather from a deliberate framing, fundamentally changed perceptions. Criticism no longer seemed purely reactive, but increasingly orchestrated. The focus was less on causes than on effects. This mechanism was effective. By establishing Britain as the antagonist, responsibility could be redirected. Complex internal conflicts were externalized. Public sentiment found a clear target, while internal dynamics faded from view. A consistent picture emerged for the public, leaving little room for nuance. This reassessment caused irritation in the British public sphere, as it called into question not only past events but also their own role as recipients of information. The central question became whether sentiment and solidarity had been deliberately channeled, not out of malice, but out of strategic calculation, a calculation that promised clarity and thus generated approval. The consequences of this framing were far-reaching. Institutions fell under general suspicion, individual voices were lost, and differentiation was misunderstood as relativization. In this climate, divisions solidified, while the actual core of the conflicts remained increasingly unclear. Britain became a breeding ground for frustration, while internal decision-making processes remained largely invisible. For Prince Harry, this mechanism only became apparent in retrospect. Loyalty to a clear narrative had long prevented the consideration of alternative interpretations. But with increasing distance came the realization that narratives not only describe but also shape, and that the choice of adversary is crucial for the stability of a story. This insight marked another turning point, as it made clear that public discourse was shaped less by facts than by interpretive frameworks. Britain had not actively chosen this role but had been assigned it, an assignment that remained effective as long as it went unchallenged. At the end of this period, an uncomfortable question hung in the air. When an entire country becomes a projection screen, who truly benefits from this simplification? And what happens when the public begins to question not only the messages but also their very structure? With the growing distance from the established narratives, another pattern emerged. What had long been considered mere coincidence now appeared in a new light. Controversies did not arise sporadically but followed a discernible dramatic structure. Escalations were conspicuously concentrated around moments of heightened attention. To observers, it increasingly seemed as if conflicts themselves had acquired a functional value. In this context, Meghan Markle once again became the focus of analysis, this time not as a public figure, but as a strategic factor. While Prince Harry bore the immediate consequences in the public eye, she remained remarkably stable. Criticism bounced off her, while he became the face of the conflict. This asymmetry became all the more noticeable the more frequently it occurred. Escalations generated reach. Reach created interpretive dominance. In this logic, moral categories lost their significance. The crucial question was no longer whether a conflict could be avoided, but whether it was exploited. Attention became a resource, controversy an accelerator. Every public uproar opened up new possibilities for reinforcing or redirecting existing narratives. For Prince Harry, this dynamic meant a constant shift in his role. He became the bearer of the consequences. Public criticism, media sensationalism, and personal attacks were primarily directed at him. His position made him vulnerable. His visibility transformed him into a projection screen. Meanwhile, the strategic dimension remained largely invisible. This constellation led to a palpable imbalance. Responsibility and consequences became separated. Decisions prepared behind closed doors unfolded their repercussions in the public sphere, concentrated on one individual. The perception that controversies were deliberately provoked fundamentally altered the evaluation of past events. In Britain, this realization slowly began to take hold. Commentators no longer spoke solely about content, but about timing, sequences, and patterns. Scandals no longer appeared isolated, but embedded in larger contexts. The question was no longer what had happened, but when and why. This became particularly evident in the repeated shifts in public opinion. While Prince Harry was increasingly perceived as an overwhelmed figure, Meghan Markle remained outside the direct line of criticism. Her absence from the escalations did not appear accidental, but rather purposeful. It allowed for distance, while the public debate created a different dynamic. For him personally, this development led to an inner rupture. The realization that personal suffering and public controversy were intertwined, but not equally distributed, altered his perception of his own role. Loyalty had long prevented him from openly acknowledging this dynamic. But the repetition could no longer be ignored. Controversy had become currency. Every escalation raised the stakes. Every reaction amplified the effect. In this system, restraint was not protection but a risk. Hesitation meant losing control. Escalation meant gaining attention. This logic contradicted everything Prince Harry had learned about responsibility and the public eye. By the end of this section, a bitter realization had crystallized. He was not merely part of the controversies, but their vehicle. His persona absorbed the consequences of a strategy built on visibility. The inevitable question now was no longer whether this dynamic existed, but how long it could be sustained and what would happen if the one bearing the burden refused to continue in that role. The turning point didn't come abruptly, but as the result of a long build-up. After years of public escalations, shifting responsibilities, and growing inner distance, Prince Harry reached a point where the existing pattern could no longer be maintained. Not out of defiance, not out of revenge, but out of necessity to regain control over his own story. Until then, restraint had been considered protection. Silence was interpreted as loyalty, as discipline, as a willingness to sacrifice. But over time, it became clear that this very silence had become an instrument. It allowed others to retain the power of interpretation while he himself bore the consequences. The realization that passivity was not neutral, but effective, marked the true turning point. Publicly, the change appeared unspectacular. No revelation, no dramatic break. But beneath the surface, everything was changing. Prince Harry began to draw boundaries, not loudly, but consistently. He refused to automatically adopt other people's narratives and withdrew from the role of permanent shield. This decision was not easy, for it meant saying goodbye to a familiar self-image. In the British public sphere, this step was closely observed. The tone of the reporting shifted once again. Speculation became observation. Blame became analysis. The question was no longer who was right, but who would determine the interpretation going forward. Prince Harry signaled that this interpretation was no longer shared. Meghan Markle also appeared different in this new context. Not through active statements, but through her position within the overall picture. The previous separation between public escalation and strategic distance, music, became more apparent. Observers recognized that roles were being redefined. What had previously been perceived as a unity began to dissolve into independent lines. This break had consequences. It ended the phase in which responsibility was automatically pooled. Future developments would have to be perceived in a more nuanced way. For Prince Harry, however, the risk music also meant freedom. The freedom no longer to be responsible for processes that were beyond his control. The step forward was simultaneously a step away from old loyalties. Not in a personal sense, but in terms of narrative. The shared history remained, but its public representation was divided. This separation was quiet but final. It marked the end of a phase in which silence could be interpreted as consent. In conclusion, a clear picture emerged. This was not an attempt at settling scores, but rather at self-definition. Prince Harry was not confronting individuals, but structures, mechanisms that exploited his reticence to protect others. The outlook remained open, but the direction was clear. The central question now hanging in the air concerned not the past, but the future. What happens when the person who has borne the burden for years refuses to shoulder it any longer? And how does public perception change when narratives are no longer told cohesively, but separately? Prince Harry's recent public signals do not mark a loud scandal, but a quiet yet consequential cessation. For years, his role was clearly defined. He was seen as a loyal defender, the face of a shared narrative, the bearer of the public consequences. But precisely this pattern began to unravel gradually, not through open accusation, but through deliberate omissions, new emphases, and a striking distance in tone and content. At the heart of this development lies a fundamental reassessment. Past decisions are not reversed, but re-evaluated. The focus shifts from questions of guilt to informational situations, from emotional defense to analytical consideration. It becomes clear that key decisions were based on limited knowledge, and that information flows were not always transparent. This realization changes the perception of the past, as well as the assessment of responsibility. At the same time, Britain's role is cast in a new light. The country appears less as an active adversary and increasingly as a projection screen for a simplified narrative. This framing proved effective because it reduced complexity and created clear lines of division. But this very simplification is now beginning to crumble. The public debate shifts from outrage to structural questions, from reaction to reflection. Meghan Markle is also perceived differently in this changed context, not through new statements, but through the visible separation of narratives. The previous unity in public representation dissolves, roles become clearer, and responsibilities are viewed in a more differentiated way. Controversies no longer appear random, but rather as part of recurring patterns in which attention is a central currency. The outcome is not a final judgment, but an open-ended perspective. Prince Harry is not withdrawing, but repositioning himself. Silence is no longer used as a sign of loyalty, but as a boundary. The crucial question remains how this separation of narratives will affect perception, responsibility, and public debate in the future, and whether the public is ready to read the story in a more complex way than it has long been accustomed to.